Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality, Vol. 1, An Introduction, La Volonté de Savoir, 1976, represents a landmark in the study of sexuality, power, and knowledge. Departing from traditional histories of sexuality, which often treated sexual repression as a simple byproduct of prudish Victorian morality or religious oppression, Foucault introduces a complex framework linking sexuality to power relations, discourse, and social regulation. The work challenges the conventional repressive hypothesis, provides an innovative historical methodology, and establishes sexuality as a central element in modern political and social analysis. 1. The repressive hypothesis. Foucault begins his analysis by interrogating what he calls the repressive hypothesis. This hypothesis, prevalent in both popular discourse and scholarly literature, posits that Western societies, especially since the 17th century, have systematically repressed sexuality. According to this view, sexuality is a natural, biological drive that has been oppressed by social institutions, religious norms, and medical authorities. In this framework, the 19th and 20th centuries, particularly Victorian society, are understood as eras of moral restraint, where sex is silenced, stigmatized, and controlled. Foucault problematizes this assumption, arguing that repression, in fact, is a modern construct and not a historical inevitability. He demonstrates that rather than silencing sexuality, Western societies have historically been preoccupied with it, particularly through discourse. Far from avoiding sex, institutions such as schools, the church, psychiatry, and medicine have talked about it incessantly, generating knowledge about sexual behavior, desires, and norms. This proliferation of discourse reveals that power over sexuality is not merely prohibitive. It is productive, creating categories of sexual identity, norms, and deviance. To power, knowledge, and sexuality. A central contribution of Foucault's work is his reconceptualization of power. Rather than viewing power as top-down, coercive, or purely juridical, Foucault emphasizes its relational, diffuse, and productive nature. Power operates through networks, institutions, and everyday practices, shaping what people know about themselves and how they conduct their lives. Sexuality, in this framework, becomes a domain in which power and knowledge are intertwined. Foucault introduces the idea of biopower, biopouvoir, which denotes mechanisms by which modern states regulate populations through the management of life itself, including birth rates, health, and sexuality. The control of sexual behavior is not simply about moral policing. It is a way of shaping populations and producing social norms. The state and its institutions exercise power by categorizing sexual behaviors, defining normal and abnormal practices, and promoting certain discourses on reproduction, marriage, and family. This approach shifts the study of sexuality from the level of individual morality to that of structural and institutional analysis. And 3. The deployment of sexuality. Foucault traces the historical development of what he terms the deployment of sexuality, le déploiement de la sexualité, focusing on the 17th to 19th centuries. During this period, sexuality becomes a central object of discourse. Rather than being repressed, sexual behavior is scrutinized, classified, and monitored in unprecedented ways. Medical, psychiatric, and educational discourses generate knowledge about sexual deviance, reproduction, and child sexuality. For example, the concept of perversion emerges not simply as moral judgment, but as a medicalized and scientific category. Foucault highlights the shift from focusing on singular acts of sexual transgression to the regulation of sexual identities in populations. Instead of punishing isolated acts, institutions develop strategies to control desires, classify sexual types, and normalize behavior. In this sense, sexuality becomes a means of governing individuals, regulating social life, and consolidating state power. 4. Confession and the production of sexual discourse. A crucial mechanism in the proliferation of sexual discourse is the practice of confession. Foucault demonstrates that confession is not merely a religious ritual, but a broader social technology that extends to medicine, education, and psychotherapy. By compelling individuals to speak about their sexual thoughts and acts, confession produces knowledge about sexuality, simultaneously regulating and shaping personal identity. Through confession, power becomes productive rather than purely prohibitive. It creates truths about sexuality, linking individuals to norms and categories. The confessional logic transforms desire into an object of analysis, monitoring, and normalization, while at the same time establishing the authority of institutions that oversee sexual knowledge. The critique of the repressive model. Foucault's critique of the repressive hypothesis has far-reaching implications. He contends that seeing sexuality primarily as repressed obscures the ways in which societies actively shape, produce, and regulate sexual identities. By focusing on repression, traditional accounts fail to recognize the complex networks of power that operate through discourses, institutions, and social practices. Instead of a history of silence and constraint, Foucault presents a history of incitement and management. Sexuality is not hidden. It is observed, analyzed, and categorized. The notion of repression is replaced by the concept of power knowledge, which allows scholars to understand sexuality as a historically contingent, socially produced, and institutionally mediated phenomenon. 6. Implications for gender and identity. Foucault's analysis has profound implications for understanding gender and sexual identity. By tracing the historical construction of sexual norms, Foucault demonstrates that identities such as homosexual, hysterical, or perverse are not timeless or natural categories, but products of discursive practices. This perspective anticipates later work in queer theory and gender studies, where the social construction of identity becomes a central concern. His focus on power as productive rather than purely repressive also shifts attention to the ways that individuals internalize norms, perform identities, and participate in their own regulation. Sexuality is therefore both a site of control and a locus of resistance, offering possibilities for transformation and critique. Historical method and discourse analysis. Foucault's methodology in the history of sexuality departs from conventional historical approaches. Rather than tracing a linear narrative of moral oppression, he employs a genealogical method inspired by Nietzsche that emphasizes discontinuities, ruptures, and transformations in discourse over time. By analyzing medical texts, psychiatric manuals, educational policies, and confessional practices, Foucault reconstructs the historical regimes of truth surrounding sexuality. Discourse analysis becomes a key tool. Rather than treating sex as a biological or moral fact, Foucault examines how knowledge about sex is produced, circulated, and regulated. He shows that what counts as true or normal is historically contingent and intimately tied to power relations. This approach has influenced a wide range of disciplines, from sociology and history to feminist theory and cultural studies. 8. Modern implications. The work's implications extend beyond historical analysis. By demonstrating the productive role of power in shaping sexuality, Foucault challenges contemporary assumptions about freedom, agency, and morality. Modern sexuality is deeply intertwined with social institutions, norms, and discourses, suggesting that individual desires are never purely personal, but always socially mediated. Furthermore, Foucault's insights into biopower and the deployment of sexuality illuminate contemporary debates around reproductive rights, sexual education, LGBTQ+ politics, and public health. Policies that regulate sexual behavior, whether through surveillance, medicalization, or legal frameworks, reflect the continuing interplay of power, knowledge, and identity that Foucault elucidated. 9. Criticisms and debates. While highly influential, the history of sexuality, Volume 1, has also faced criticism. Some scholars argue that Foucault overemphasizes discourse at the expense of material conditions, economic structures, and lived experience. Others note that his genealogical approach can obscure individual agency or resistance. Critics also question the universality of his claims, noting that his analysis primarily focuses on European contexts and may not fully account for global variations in sexual norms and regulation. Nevertheless, the book's theoretical innovations and methodological rigor continue to make it foundational for studies of sexuality, power, and social history. Conclusion. Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality, 1, fundamentally reshaped the way scholars understand sexuality. By challenging the repressive hypothesis, linking sexuality to networks of power, and tracing the historical production of sexual discourse, Foucault demonstrates that sexuality is not merely a personal or biological phenomenon, but a socially and historically mediated construct. His analysis of confession, biopower, and the deployment of sexuality highlights the productive nature of power and its role in shaping identity, social norms, and governance. Ultimately, Foucault's work encourages a rethinking of sexuality not as an area of repression, but as a complex field of knowledge, regulation, and possibility. It has influenced a wide range of disciplines, including sociology, history, gender studies, queer theory, and political science, establishing a framework for understanding how modern societies govern, categorize, and engage with human desire. This analysis can also be adapted into Spanish or German for comparative study or multilingual research.